At the end of the reveal panel for Wilds of Eldraine at MagicCon Barcelona, Gavin Verhey and Mark Rose were running over on time because they both enthusiastically talk too much about Magic the Gathering, which honestly is kind of relatable. And because they were running over time, they dropped a bombshell, like a mic drop moment, that White was getting its own Craterhoof Behemoth. Moonshaker Cavalry is an 8-mana 6/6 flying spirit knight, and when it enters the battlefield, creatures you control gain flying and get +X/+X, where X is the number of creatures you control. It is in Wilds of Eldraine. It's available now in packs. Now, if it isn't obvious, the card is not quite as good as Craterhoof Behemoth. To be honest, most people spotted this, and this was the main talking point, is that it's a shame, or oh well, White gets a crap Craterhoof Behemoth. The reasons that Moonshaker Cavalry isn't as good as Craterhoof Behemoth, I will go over briefly. Essentially, green ramps easier, plays a lot of smaller creatures that ramp you into this end goal, and also can cheat out a fatty. Green has easy access to cards that just tutor up the creature you need if you have the mana, but also other cards that let you cheat creatures into play like Natural Order, and thus, Craterhoof Behemoth is not a big ask. Meanwhile, a white deck in Commander or the older formats may struggle to make a Moonshaker Cavalry with the mana available to it and the abilities that White tends to have. So saying that Moonshaker Cavalry is nowhere near as good as Craterhoof Behemoth is true when it's honest, but let's be real, Craterhoof Behemoth is one of the best green creatures ever printed. It might just be the best green finisher of all time if you are playing a deck that'll have a lot of creatures in it. And that's what I wanted to talk about in today's video. The fact that Moonshaker Cavalry is worse than Craterhoof Behemoth is not just okay, it's actually a good thing. Before we jump into it, if you want to pick up some Moonshaker Cavalry or similar, why not check out the link in the description below to coolstuffinc.com, use the code KENOBI at checkout and get 5% off your order. And all videos on this channel are also sponsored by me. That's right, I'm my biggest fan. But if you want to be a big fan, why don't you check out patreon.com/PleasantKenobi. You can spend $2 a month to get access to my Discord server where we hang out and chat about Magic and all sorts of shit, as well as having occasional Arena, MTGO, and Paper Proxy Magic events and Warhammer events with prizes on them too. There's a link in the description below to my Patreon, and for less than the price of a coffee, you too can get involved with a little community full of all sorts of weird fucking characters. Now, I mentioned this as part of a super cycle or mega cycle. That's the idea that a cycle can exist across multiple sets. It can take literally years or decades for us to get around to having a new entry in that cycle. A cycle is a mechanically similar cycle or rotation of cards, usually one in each of the color pairs. That means it'll be like the card with the sets mechanic in it, a card with a certain cycling mechanic on it. It'll be a 2/2 bear with the sets mechanic on it in each color or similar. A good example of this that I come to quite often is Volrath's Stronghold from Stronghold, Academy Ruins from Time Spiral, and Hall of Heliod's Generosity from Modern Horizons. These cards are literally separated by around a decade each until we got each one, and we still don't have a red or a green one, but all of them do a thematic or mechanically similar thing. They interact with the graveyard to give you back something that fits in with their part of the colour pie, with black getting creatures out of the bin, blue getting artifacts out of the bin, and white getting enchantments. One day we may get a green one that does something with lands, or a red one that does something with only instants, or anything if you can cast it this turn, or some sort of slightly more impulsive or red themed version. This is a mega or mega or super cycle. The name of it often changes depending on who you're talking to. I thought it was also called a super cycle until I started writing this video and did a quick Google to make sure I wasn't making shit up, and one of the wikis is like, it's a mega cycle, so there you go. But Craterhoof was always just a standalone huge fucking fatty from Avacyn Restored, and there's never really any inkling that another colour should get a copy of it, except that people pointed out that going wide and having a payoff is actually really White's thing, and green, well, green has it too. People argue that white has it primarily and green has it secondarily. There's a lot of discussion around what each colour can do, whether it does it primarily, secondarily, or tertiary and similar. The way that black can now remove enchantments is a tertiary thing as long as it has a downside, that sort of stuff. And that was like just a little talking point that people would bring up when discussing the high-powered cards in Commander and Eternal formats like Craterhoof Behemoth. So I think it's really neat that Wizards of the Coast have gotten around to making a white one. And we may not see a blue, black, or a red one for another 5, 10, 15 years, because it's not a priority, but it's not also not outside the realms of possibility that they might complete the super cycle. But not all cycles are created equal. The original boon cycle, a 1 mana spell that does something that the colour's meant to do 3 times, are grossly imbalanced. Drawing 3 cards, or to a lesser extent making 3 mana, is so much more powerful than gaining 3 life. White often gets the short end of the stick because it's often the colour pairing that doesn't do the most exciting things, making 1/1s or gaining new life. But this video is not about white getting the short end of the stick. I think Wizards have done a good job at undoing that or improving upon that in recent years. This video is about how that Moonshaker Cavalry being good but not better is absolutely categorically a good thing. It's safe to say that Magic the Gathering has had an incredible issue with power creep in recent years. Not only have standard sets given us cards that have been banned in older formats, but we've had the emergence, the rise and the popularity of the Horizon sets, where Magic the Gathering's greatest minds as design teams and pros who are brought in to consult end up concocting things that are looking to quite literally jump the shark. The design goals of things like Horizons is to inject a lot of new cards into older formats that are good enough to see play, and thus you have to compete with 30 years of either design mistakes and good or bad shit to make better things. And ultimately what that leads to is a hell of a lot of power creep. And when I say power creep, I mean where you have to just make things better than they used to be to keep the excitement level up, to keep new cards playable. Power creep is dangerous because not only does it invalidate all the things that you were doing in the past, all the cards that already existed, Loxodon Smiter being borderline fucking useless. I say borderline, he's unplayable now. And he's one of my favourite elephant boys. But not only does it invalidate all the old stuff, it causes future designing to be very difficult. You essentially start to use up design space. Like, the more powerful you go, it gives you less room to push the power level later, unless you really have to keep jumping the shark and outdoing yourself. And it becomes a very difficult situation where you are just making things that are grossly more powerful than the majority of stuff. And you start to really front load all the power and magic in the most latest things. I don't think we're at critical mass or a serious, exponential curve right now, but we're in danger of that. And Wizards are aware of this and they have took precautions. Look at Lord of the Rings. People like myself were very scared and openly said that we believed it was going to be Modern Horizons 3.0. And outside of a handful of cards like the One Ring and Bowmasters, they, for the most part, were careful enough not to completely fuck the game with a whole set that's just better than everything else that's ever come before. And if we want to talk about an example that might help you if you are more a Commander player than Legacy or Modern, Jeweled Lotus is probably the best example of this. An incredibly pushed and forced super staple. Super staple is a term that I use. They're cards that are so good, you basically have to argue not to include them instead of arguing to include them. And thus, the vast majority of the decks just auto-include it. At the point you have a colourless super staple, it basically becomes not included in every deck. And that is not a good place to be. Because if you did that too much, you have a situation where 20% of decks are just the same cards, right? We already have that with like Sol Ring, Command Tower, to an extent Jeweled Lotus, and then we have a few things, an Arcane Signet. So there's already 4, arguably maybe even Lightning Greaves, but 4 that are already auto-included in every single deck. So 4% of every Commander deck is going to be the same, outside of outliers that don't use Jeweled Lotus very well. Also, if you're going to sit and argue in the comment section that you shouldn't play Sol Ring because your Commander isn't easily cast off of it, I'm going to say bollocks, because most of the other cards in your deck will be easily castable off of it. It's very hipster to argue that Sol Ring is not good enough for your deck. Fuck it, I used to do that by Touch Over. I played a lot of double or triple or quadruple green cards, and ultimately using Sol Ring to power out even the cards that aren't like that was just too good. A turn 2 Cultivate or turn 2 or 3 Oracle of Moldiah was just too good. So now I've moaned about Modern Horizons, and I don't think I'm moaning, I'm more talking about the ongoing issues we have with stuff like that existing, and this applies to other things outside of Horizons too. Think of things like Ochre and Luris in recent times that were basically so good they dominated every format they touched. That is power creep that you really need to avoid, and Wizards are going to be careful with it. So Moonshaker Cavalry being slightly different in many ways. Its evasion being flying instead of trample. It being a 6/6 not a 5/5. And the bit that I think is the most, probably the coolest way to differentiate it from the big beastie that is Craterhoof Behemoth is the Spirit Knight creature type. There might be a world in the future where you can put Spirits or Knights into play free off of something, or you can cost reduce a Knight by 3, 4, or 5 and this becomes playable. The creature type synergies are ways that you can make the cards different in ways that will make them playable in different situations, which I quite like. But ultimately, I don't want to wake up one day and find out that not only is Craterhoof Behemoth worse than something else, so if you're playing green-white, you play this instead, or you just play both for 2 copies of it. But I also also don't want every time we get one in this cycle or a big haymaker go wide finisher like this to be better than the last, because we have that snowballing effect that I just mentioned, the power creep. If anything, this is a conscious decision to make things slightly different and a little bit worse, and thus give us more time to play in the area we are now before we start climbing that peak of power creep and we have to leave all this stuff behind. Now, the argument I'm making could of course be made for bad cards that are just shit, or let's say, to not get too in the weeds about that, strictly worse cards. That's not what I'm getting at. I'm not asking Wizards of the Coast to depower Magic significantly. I'm asking for them not to go out of their way to outdo themselves in the past. I'd rather they explored new design space. In many ways, Companion is one of those things. A mechanic that I often criticize heavily as being one of, if not the worst mechanic they've ever done in terms of absolutely fucking the game in every format. But I think that's more defensible, that's more excusable that they went a completely wild route and fucked things up than just putting strictly better versions of shit like we've seen with some of the Modern Horizons cards. But that said, sometimes some strictly worse cards can just be better for the game. Did you know that once upon a time, Mana Drain was not strictly better than Counterspell? It wasn't Counterspell, but with extra text that was almost never bad. Because if you had mana in your mana pool that you didn't spend at the end of a phase, it would burn you. So if you were to Mana Drain someone for a 6 mana spell, but only use 4 of it, you'd take 2 damage. That was removed quite some time ago. We're talking almost 2 decades, maybe more ago. And thus, Mana Drain became strictly, no downside, better than Counterspell. However, I don't mind them printing Counterspell. Counterspell still sees play in Legacy where Mana Drain is banned, for example. I'm all for them printing strictly worse versions of some of the best cards ever printed. I think that's probably fine. But again, this isn't strictly worse. Different color, different creature types, slightly different mechanical identity. I really like it. I love that White has got one of these finally after years of joking that it should have been the color that got it, and I'm really glad that they didn't jump the Behemoth and make a stupid fucking overpowered version of Craterhoof Behemoth. As a last note though, super interestingly, they probably could have crept the power in this specific circumstance due to what I said earlier about how White would struggle to play it compared to Green, that White doesn't have a natural order Finale or Green Sun Zenith to power out or find it. White struggles. Its tutors are normally quite specific about what they can get. Recruiter of the Guard, for example, can't get a Moonshaker Cavalier. So ironically, in spite of me praising the idea that we aren't just jumping the shark over and over and over, there is a world where you could have power crept the white one because all the support tools around it are worse than the green one. But then again, they can both be played in the green-white deck, so tomato, tomato. I hope you've enjoyed this small little exercise, this thought in my head that became a thing I wanted to talk about in a video. I just think that depowering Magic in some ways, even subtly to the side, is good. It's productive towards a healthier game in our longer term. Horizons is unhealthy for the game, but Moonshaker Cavalry, I think it's healthy for the game. If you enjoyed the video, let me know in the comment section below, and why not check out my Patreon. $2 a month to help support me do what I do. Link is in the description below, and I'll see you in the next one. Ta-ta for now, you slacks.